It's time for Herd Mentality, the weekly episode where you control the discussion today on Locked On Bills.
You are Locked On Bills, your daily Buffalo Bills podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Bills Mafia? It's Joe Marino, author of Go Bills and Buffalo's Run, also the co-host of the Locked On NFL Scouting Podcast, and I'm your host of Locked On Bills. Want to thank you for making Locked On Bills your first listen every day, and a big welcome and shout out to our everydayers. You know who you are. Those of you who never miss a single episode, I appreciate y'all being here very, very much. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started. Well, folks, welcome in tons of great herd mentality items to get into a great variety of topics. So let's waste no time. Let's jump right into it. The first one comes from Bills fan 1988, who says, beyond Josh Allen, how concerned are you that the rest of our roster lacks eliteness? I know they're not everything, but I'm not seeing a lot of Bills players in top-tier PFF and top 100 rankings for 2024. My concern is that this roster is good across many positional groups, but lacks elite-level guys that can take over games. This would potentially cause us to compete really well in just about any game, but come up short in the big ones. Do you share the same sentiment? I think it's valid to say that the Bills don't have the same like superstar power as maybe they did in the past. And I think you're probably thinking about what Stephon Diggs has been, what Tre'Davious White has been, Micah Hyde, Jordan Poyer, and these guys not being around. But I think that the Bills do have a quality roster. There's just not necessarily maybe this deep list of like proven superstars, right? There's no Travis Kelce and Chris Jones to go with Patrick Mahomes. But I think there's a lot to say, though. I think the Bills do have a very good roster. And I think obviously that starts with Josh Allen, who I think is the second best football player in the NFL outside of Patrick Mahomes. That's a big deal. And I think the stars on this team, right, the elite level talent, they're still emerging players. And I would say in seeing some of these top 100 rankings, not having a guy like Dion Dawkins on it is crazy to me. I think Dion Dawkins is absolutely a franchise cornerstone offensive tackle. No question about it. And then other players on offense, you're looking at a Dalton Kincaid entering year 2. Khalil Shakir kind of broke out last year. We're expecting big things this year. What's Keon Coleman? James Cook, that guy had one heck of a season last year. O'Cyrus Torrence, a developing young offensive lineman. Spencer Brown. You know, I think that's the deal is like there's a lot of very good players. They're just not necessarily universally recognized as stars. On defense, Von Miller is certainly supposed to be one of these superstar players for the Bills. We'll see what he can offer this year. I think maybe some people are sleeping on Matt Milano. I mean, I think he's one of the best off-ball linebackers in football. Taron Johnson's an all-pro slot corner. Rasul Douglas is one heck of a starting corner. Ed Oliver, Greg Rousseau is a young developing player. Same thing with Terrel Bernard, Christian Benford. I think that's what it comes down to is there's like really talented players that I think can be high-impact starters. They're just not necessarily universally recognized, and a lot of them are very young. But no, it's not Travis Kelce and Chris Jones. It's not that, right? I totally understand that. In fact, one of the things that I recently did over the last like 2 months over on the other podcast that I do daily, Locked On NFL Scouting, is we assess every roster in the NFL. We literally just finished that end of last week. And we're spending this week and the following weeks kind of sharing our big picture results. We've done each individual team, but we're sharing our big picture results. And the Bills scored pretty well. I mean, the Bills are still looked at by us as one of the best rosters in the NFL. And we do factor in like your franchise cornerstone players, your elite level guys, they're given a higher score. And so we put all the players in the NFL in buckets and we score it for every team. The Bills did really good, despite not necessarily having this long list of guys that you say, yeah, that guy's going to be a for sure Pro Bowler this year. I think the reality is a lot of those players are young and people are still catching up to how good they are. And so, like I said, I've assessed every roster in the NFL. The Bills are going to rank very, very high on that. I might bring some of those discussions here to this podcast as well to kind of just compare and contrast how I see the Bills compared to the rest of the NFL. But I think it's fair to say, nope, there's not like superstars that are proven and to go with Josh Allen, but there's a lot of very good young developing players that are knocking on the door. And I think there's definitely some players that people are fully sleeping on. Next one here comes from Michael, who says, who would you say are your top 5 players you're most intrigued to hear about this training camp? And Michael offered his own personal list. He said Keon Coleman, Curtis Samuel, Dwayne Carter, Dalton Kincaid, and Cedric Van Pran Granger. We've got some carryover here. I've got 2 of the same players that you do. Let me give you my list. It starts with Keon Coleman. Just very fascinated to hear about how he's doing in training camp, but I am going to be there for an entire week. So I'll take in, I think, 5 practices. So I'll get my own eyes on this stuff, and I'll, of course, share it with everyone here on the podcast. But Keon Coleman's one of the guys I'm very excited to find out about, and not necessarily just because he's the top pick that the Bills had this year and that he's got a chance to be an impact playmaker for this team for a long time. But, there's a wide range of opinions on him and the prospect that he is and how that applies to the NFL. I'm excited to get a chance to look at that and see what that looks like, of course, at the infancy stage of his NFL career. So he's high on my list. David Edwards at left guard. I think this is a huge, huge piece of the Bills this coming season is that transition with Connor McGovern going to center and David Edwards, the assumed starter at left guard. I want to see where he's at. Matt Milano, number 3 for me. Obviously one of those guys that can be a superstar and has been a superstar for this team. What does he look like coming back from injury? And, can he just pick up where he left off and be a high impact playmaker alongside Terrel Bernard? Dalton Kincaid, I have as number 4. This is another guy that I think has a chance to be a superstar for this team and be so this year and lead this team in receiving and lead this team in targets and be that go-to guy for Josh Allen and really funnel a lot of this passing game through Dalton Kincaid. I want to see where he's at in year 2. And the last guy is Cole Bishop. And he's different than the other guys on this list in some ways, maybe kind of similar to Keon Coleman, but I feel like things have been really quiet there. And we just didn't hear much regarding Cole Bishop coming out of OTAs and mandatory camp. And I want to get a feel for where he's at right now in terms of being ready to contribute, or if he's really knocking on the door to be the starter opposite of Taylor Rapp. Is he a guy that might be the 3rd or 4th safety this year? If he's not a starter, is there a role for him? He's a 2nd-round pick. I'm very curious to see what his prospects are this year and how he factors into the mix. So that would be my list of 5 guys. But I could have went all day. I could have sit here and given you a reason that I'm intrigued about every single player on the roster. But those 5 really kind of stood out to me the most. Next one is from Tony, who says, excuse me, here is a question to try to predict Kaiir Elam's future with the Bills. We know that Sean McDermott allows his position coaches to determine playing time. I'm not sure that's entirely true. I think Sean McDermott has a lot to do with that. Those coaches handle the techniques used within the scheme. What do we know about Jamil Adai as far as his technique usage compared to John Butler? I'm going to take the opportunity to answer this question more along the lines of Kaiir Elam's future with the Bills, because I think there's too much assumption involved in the rest of that with position coaches determining playing time. I'm sure they have a huge influence, but I think those decisions are ultimately Sean McDermott's. And Jamil Adai, certainly a great track record in college with his coaching, some very good case studies to point to. But we got to learn so much more about him too, with the Bills before we start talking this level of detail. But from a high level, my forecast for Kaiir Elam is, first of all, by starting with saying what I say every time I talk about Kaiir Elam, and that the book is simply not written on him. I mean, he just turned 23 years old in May. The Bills drafted players older than Kaiir Elam this year. So he's young. He's literally just turned 23. And for all the inconsistency that people point to, he's played well when he's been given the opportunity to get on the field, and he's made impact plays. There's no denying that. I think more of the conversation regarding Kaiir Elam is because he's a first-round pick and a sixth-round pick, Christian Benford, is playing over him. It's not necessarily, I think if Christian Benford didn't exist, if the Bills drafted some developmental offensive tackle that we forgot about instead of Christian Benford, I think Kaiir Elam would be a pretty decent starter for this team. And we would say, oh, he's only 23 and he's shown us this already, right? Like, it's funny how that conversation could be so different just based on a very small variable. And so the book's not written. He's young. He's made impact plays when he's been on the field, including in the playoffs. And I think for this year, I think he's going to be CB3. 2024, he's CB3, a spot starter. And the point that I go back to with that is Dane Jackson has been the CB3 for the Bills over the last 3 seasons. Never the preferred starter. He started 26 games over the last 3 seasons. The CB3 for the Bills plays. So it's only a matter of time before Kaiir Elam is playing meaningful snaps for the Bills once again. And that probably means that somebody got hurt, probably Christian Benford, right? Because he's had a lot of time missed over the last 2 seasons. And Kaiir Elam's number is going to be called. How does he fare? I think for 2024, he's a spot starter, CB3. In 2025, remember, this is Rasul Douglas's contract year. I think that the Bills will have Kaiir Elam in line to start opposite of Christian Benford in 2025. Now, there's probably some meaningful competition there, but I think that could very well be what the next 2 years look like for Kaiir Elam. And then, of course, he's a free agent after 2025, assuming the Bills don't pick up his 5th-year option, which I think is a fair assumption. We'll see, right? But again, the book is not written. All right, folks, plenty more to get to, including what led to Ed Oliver's breakout season, cap space, the edge rushers, and more, so be sure to stick with me. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. They've got some fun futures bets for the Bills, actually, that I've been checking out over at FanDuel. Some over-unders for statistical production in 2024 for the Bills. I think the over could hit on all 3 of these. James Cook, they have his rushing yards over-under set at 875.5. Josh Allen's passing yards over-under set at 3,750.5. And Dalton Kincaid's receiving yards, 775.5. I say go smash the over on all 3 of those. Head on over to FanDuel.com and start making the most of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, the next one today comes from Zach, who says, you did a podcast last offseason on Ed Oliver, where you talked about his physical limitations and how that forced him to work overtime. What changed in his play this year that allowed him to excel? All right, Zach, appreciate the questions. I did do an entire podcast on Ed Oliver. And one thing that I discussed in that was some of his physical limitations, mass and length, and how that sometimes forced him to work overtime to beat blocks. And what I mean by that is because he lacks mostly length. I mean, mass is one thing. I'm not super concerned about his lack of mass. It's the lack of length. He's got sub 32-inch arms, 31 3/4-inch arms. That's 7th percentile for NFL defensive tackles. Very short arms. And so the point that I made there is that, you're looking for impact plays, right? Tackles for loss, sacks. And you have to be mindful that Ed Oliver doesn't necessarily check the length box. And because of that, he has to work overtime to beat blocks on occasion, right? If his technique fails. Because, trench play in the NFL is about low pads and hand usage. Can you out-leverage your opponent, and can you use your hands to control reps? And when you don't have anatomical length, your technique has to be really good because you can get outreached. And, if you're outreached, you're not going to be able to use your hands to be able to get off blocks and control reps. And so it's just a simple reality of short arms. That's the reality that you have to live in. And that forces you to work overtime because now you have to get into counter moves and you're not winning with first contact as frequently. And so that's what I meant by, hey, look, if the technique's not right or his technique doesn't work on a particular player, he gets out-techniqued by his opponent, he's going to have to work overtime to win that rep. But what were the differences, right? Ed Oliver had the big breakout season this past year that we've been yearning for. I think three things come to mind. I'll start by saying he's a young player. Everybody wants it so fast for these guys, but they're young and they're human beings and they take time to learn and develop what they're supposed to do. Last season in 2023 was his age 25 season, and he had a big transition to the NFL. People forget this. He was at Houston, and he played nose tackle in an odd front defense. I mean, and a lot of times it was like this bear front where he's playing head up over the center as a nose tackle. Sometimes truly three-man looks, and he's the nose. It's a different position than playing as a penetration style 3 technique. So a young player that didn't do the things he was asked to do in the NFL and college, and there's a transition there. That sounds a little bit like Kaiir Elam, right? I'm kind of glad I answered those questions in consecutive order. He's a young player at a slow developing position that was asked to do something very different in college that he was asked to do for the Bills. It takes a little time. I think number 2 is that he had less nagging injuries, played a career high 730 regular season snaps. That's the most of his career in 5 seasons by over 100. I mean, and don't poo-poo at 100 snaps. I mean, that's 2 games worth of typical snaps, which, 2 more games worth of production, basically. And then I think the other thing is the double team rate was down. You can look at it, find numbers in various places, roughly 10% dip in double team rate. And I credit that to scheme. I think a coordinator's job is to put your players in positions to be successful and make plays. And I think Sean McDermott did that better than Leslie Frazier has. So on top of him being a young developing player and the transition and less nagging injuries, I think he was put in more situations where he can be successful by having one-on-one matchups. Like that's all you can ask for as a player, as a defensive lineman. Give me one-on-one battles. And I thought, like I said, in some metrics, you'll see that it's about 10% of a dip in double team rate, which I think allowed him to have more one-on-one chances. So I think some of the scheme usage and how Sean McDermott deployed him compared to Leslie Frazier led to better looks and better chances for Ed Oliver. So I think a lot goes into it. I think this is what Ed Oliver has to replicate. I think Ed Oliver still needs to make that big step in terms of, okay, this is a postseason game. I'm going to make big time plays. He closed out that Chargers game for the Bills last year. More of that in the playoffs, right? That's what we're kind of looking for. But love the trajectory. I love the contract. I saw some people, I was texting with some folks in our subtext community that somebody said recently, he's like, I think if Ed Oliver signed this offseason as opposed to last, I mean, it could have been as much as $8-10 million more a season. And I think the proof there is what Christian Wilkins got. Christian Wilkins got his big breakout season this past year in terms of sack production. He's like one of the highest paid players in the history of the NFL. And so I think you could have saw something quite similar for Ed Oliver if he hit the market this past season. Tom says, after watching your review on how much we may have to pay to keep our young talent when their contracts are up, I keep having one thought. How are we going to afford all these guys with such limited cap? I know it opens up a bit after this year, and hopefully Von's contract is gone next year. But of those 6 players you reviewed, how many can we or should we plan on being able to pay? And then how much will that put us in future cap hell? There's a lot you could talk about there. I think it's a great problem to have. You got a bunch of really good young players. You got to figure out which ones to keep. And I think you obviously prioritize what they do and how hard they would be to replace if you lost them and all that. You consider all of that. And I think this season is a huge data point, right, that we're looking for to give us clarity beyond this year as to who to pay. So you're still gathering information here. But there's some things to be, I guess, you can find some optimism in or some peace in. The salary cap continues to go up. It always does. I mean, one year, the COVID year, It didn't go up. It's going to continue going up. Gambling money's coming into the NFL. It's a big deal, right? The TV stuff, it's a big deal. I think also Brandon Beane has a lot of levers to pull, right? I mean, those levers that we talk about, restructures, extensions, different cap gymnastics, there's plenty of that available to him in future years. I think this is a big benefit of the roster reset that happened this year. If the Bills would have continued to kind of cling to some of those aging players and make it work and really stretch things, it would have made things more difficult in these future years that you're thinking about. And I think that's why I push so hard. If you guys remember, even in season, I was talking about the Bills and we had our quarterly report cards on the team. And I said, look, there are some parts of this roster that are expiring and there's hard decisions to be made this season and needs to reset and transition in some areas. And Brandon Beane kind of did exactly what I was hoping that he would do. And a lot of that is with all of these young players in mind and being able to usher in this next chapter of the Josh Allen era of Buffalo Bills football. So I think that's the roster reset helps bring clarity to these opportunities in the future. Oh, by the way, dead cap space is getting cleared up. The Bills obviously have a huge dead cap hit this year in the form of Stephon Diggs, over $30 million, but there's others, right, that hit this year. That'll start cleaning up in future years. But it comes down to this. You got to make good decisions if you're Brandon Beane on who to keep and who to let walk. If you keep players and pay them, those contracts have to perform. I keep going back to this. That was one of the biggest problems with the 2023 Bills is your highest paid players either were not performing at the level that they needed to or they were injured, right? So if you pay a player in a limited resource environment, the NFL, and you commit cap dollars to them, you got to get returns on that. So make the right decisions on who to keep, and those guys have to perform. And of course, that also means making the right decisions on who to let walk. You don't want to overpay for middling talent. And then what does it always come back to? The draft. Draft well, draft and develop. That cycle is a beautiful thing when it works. And that's what put the Bills in this position. They had a draft class where they got James Cook and Khalil Shakir and Terrel Bernard and Christian Benford. And you need some more of those. And looking good. You got, Dalton Kincaid, Osiris Torrance, right? That looks like a nice couple of impact players for this team. What is this year's draft class going to bring? This is the lifeblood of a football team. And the good news is the Bills are completely loaded with draft picks. They're going to be one of the most capital-rich teams in the 2025 draft. And how Beane maximizes that flexibility, what that turns into is going to be huge. That's what's going to dictate how good this football team is going to be into the future. Next one comes from James, who says, the one area I'm not sold on is defensive end. So what's the plan? Opposing offenses should have to alter their schemes if we have legitimate threats to sack the quarterback. Is anyone scared of an aging and injured Von Miller, inconsistent Epenesa, injured Smoot, and rookie Solomon? Rousseau is great, but he seems to need an opposite defensive end on the other side to open up his ability. Do you think BBB is going to make a late move to get a legit defensive end? I think it's a valid concern, James. It's probably my biggest concern with this football team. And you're even talking about this situation, and I think you painted a very doom and gloom picture, right? I think it's fair to look at your assessment and come away with that takeaway. But to me, the biggest talking point here is your leading sacker, one of your best pass rushers, Leonard Floyd. You let him walk in free agency, and you didn't do anything. Like, you basically drafted Javon Solomon and signed DeJuan Smoot, and that was your answer for losing your leading sacker. And I have my issues with Leonard Floyd because I think he completely disappeared down the stretch when the Bills needed him most. So he fell right into the Ed Oliver thing. Like, thanks for everything during the regular season. Where the heck were you against Kansas City? You know, I definitely feel that. So yeah, I'm concerned about this. And I think if Von Miller was who Von Miller is supposed to be, that changes the dynamics of the situation completely, but that's not the case. And so what's the plan? Well, Greg Rousseau continues his development as a young player. AJ Epenesa does build off what he did the last 2 seasons with more opportunity. And of course, I think the inconsistency of AJ Epenesa has been related to injuries. I think it's Von Miller having some level of an impact on this team that is somewhat close to what we hope. And then I would push back on your Dwayne Smoot's injury comment. I mean, he got injured late in 2022 with an Achilles, And he played 12 games last season. So he's like further removed from that. He's not injured. We'll see. We'll see how much impact this group can make. I think it's a huge storyline for the 2024 Buffalo Bills as in terms of the idea that the Bills can make a move for a defensive end. My whole point with the Bills and the resources that they have, whether it's draft capital or it's cap space, right? Let it play out a little bit, get into the season a little bit and see. You've seen pass rushers, teams trade for pass rushers and them come over and make an immediate impact. Montez Sweat last year with the Bears. Von Miller when he got traded to the Rams. I think this is a world that you can live in. Find out. Like maybe you don't need a pass rusher. So if I'm Brandon Beane, I'm letting this play out a little bit. I'm not going to speculate on what my needs could be. I'm going to find out what they are and then use my resources to go do something. That's kind of my thought. Because maybe everything does come together. Maybe it doesn't. Okay, well, cool. I have draft picks and I have cap space to bring on a player. Wait it out. Let's see. Find out what your issues are. The trade deadline's pushed a week back this year. Let it play out, find out, and know that you have resources if you need them. All right, folks, got more to get to, so be sure to stick with me. Passion, drive, and patience, what brings home the formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fits only available to U.S. customers. All right, next up comes from John, who says, it would be interesting for you to rate your favorite jersey combinations of the Bills' current set. I like the blue jersey, white pants, and white socks at home. White jersey, white pants, blue socks on the road. Hate all the red looks and wish they would just switch those with the 90s home jerseys, including the red helmet. Also not a fan of the all-blue Smurf look, but don't mind blue on blue as much if they wear white socks. Your thoughts as we've reached peak offseason. All right, so my thoughts on the best uniform combinations for the Bills. Number one for me is white on white. I think that's just really clean. When they go white on white, I mean, I think it just looks really good. I mean, it's pretty much every team's undefeated best look. So that's what my favorite look. Number two is blue on white, blue jersey on white pants. I think that if you don't like the all blue or the all white, I think that's the best contrast to me in terms of having a different color jersey versus pants. I like blue jersey, white pants. Number three for me is blue on blue. Number four is white jersey on blue. I actually don't care for that one as much. And I know that the Bills have had some bad moments in that uniform combination. So that's probably my least favorite. But then number five is all red. But I do like the all red once a year. I wouldn't want to see it all the time, but once a year, it's like, that looks pretty cool. So that's my take on those iterations. I'd love to see those standing Buffalo throwbacks come back. We hadn't seen those in a while. And of course, I would love to see the 90s incorporated. So if I had my pick, the Bills would wear their standard uniforms for 14 games. And then the other three, you'd have one 90s throwback, one standing Buffalo throwback, and one color rush all red look. That would be how I would divvy out the uniforms. Bub says, could the Bills be looking to copy a mid-90s offense like the Green Bay Packers, who were led by Brett Favre and had two featured tight ends in Mark Chmura and Keith Jackson? This offense allowed for not only two tight ends, but two good receivers in Antonio Freeman and Don Beebe, as well as two running backs and their top five pass catchers. There was no receiver over 1,000 yards, nor any running backs with 1,000 rushing yards. The offense's balance was 46% rushing and 54% passing. Last year, the Bills were 46.9% rushing, 53.1% passing. The quarterbacks play similar ball, and their skill sets on the team seem similar enough to expect a modern twist on that operation. I think it's pretty logical. I like this a whole lot better than the people that invoke Tom Brady with Rob Gronkowski and Aaron Hernandez. Like, this is way more digestible to me than that. So I think it's pretty logical. The 96 Packers is who Bub's referring to. They were 13-3 Super Bowl champs that year, number one scoring offense and number one scoring defense that season. I'll say this. I mean, that was the Mike Holmgren, Andy Reid, Green Bay Packers. West Coast offense, very different. I think, so this is what I'll say. Structurally different, fundamentally similar in terms of the approach, utilization of players, spreading the ball around, incorporating multiple backs, incorporating multiple tight ends and receivers. I think that's where I can find the similarities. Aiden says, I know it's only OTAs and mandatory minicamp with no pads on, but by all accounts, it looks like Damar Hamlin had an excellent spring this year. So because of that, could Damar Hamlin be a sneaky candidate to be one of the two starting safeties opposite Taylor Rapp this season? I'm not necessarily predicting it to happen, but I do think it's a real possibility at this point. Cole Bishop is a rookie that has a pretty similar skill set to Taylor Rapp. Mike Edwards has always served as more of a third safety for a defense to his career at this point. And as much as I love Cam Lewis, he's really been a special teams player only in his career with the Bills. Plus, the contract that he resigned for with the Bills doesn't scream starting safety money. I personally feel that Hamlin as a starting safety for us this year is a storyline that's not being talked about nearly enough right now. What do you think? Well, I think you're pretty correct in everything you're saying in that Damar Hamlin has momentum. He's the most experienced player in this scheme, both in terms of time on task and game reps. Mike Edwards has been a third safety. Cole Bishop is a rookie. I'm not really counting Cam Lewis as a contender here. So, yeah, I totally get what you're saying. I think he's in the mix. I think it's been beneficial to him that he's been able to get reps because Mike Edwards hasn't practiced with the shoulder, and it doesn't really sound like Cole Bishop is knocking on the door. I think the player that's most likely to start opposite of Rapp is Mike Edwards. But to your point, he has been a third safety, but if you watch the tape, man, he looks good. He's a good football player. I'm doubtful on Cole Bishop. Maybe Micah Hyde's the answer here, folks. Maybe we're going to wake up one day and Micah Hyde's going to be back on the Bills. So we'll let it play out. I think Damar Hamlin's in the mix. If there's anything I trust with the Bills, it's safety. The resume is off the charts for Sean McDermott. I think they're going to get it right. But could you talk me into Damar Hamlin? Yeah, you could. Could you talk me into Cole Bishop? Yeah. Could you talk me into Mike Edwards? Yep. Could you talk me into Micah Hyde? Yep. It's a fascinating storyline. One of the biggest ones to me entering training camp. All right, folks, that's going to do it for us here today on the podcast. The next 2 days are going to be pretty fun. I always try to tie in a little nostalgic content during the offseason, and that's coming your way the next couple of days. So don't miss anything. Make sure that you're subscribed. Would love it if you took a second to rate, review, and share the podcast. Have a great rest of your day. Go Bills, and I look forward to catching up with you again real soon.